I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue organization, and every year, our group takes part in a late summer retreat full of team building and bonding exercises. One of these exercises involves night training, which, as you can probably imagine, involves practicing our search and rescue skills after dark. My specific job title is SNR K9 Handler, which sort of encompasses why I joined in the first place. I always wanted to work with animals, I just never had the grades to study to be a vet. And so joining as a dog handler meant the best of both worlds. I could do something constructive and contributive with my spare time, all the while playing with dogs. I use the word play very loosely there, but you get the idea. Anyway, we were out on night exercises when my dog, who is trained to find human remains, started to alert us to a scent. I was partnered with a more senior member of the team at the time, but when I looked to them for some guidance, she basically said, "Let's just go with it." Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, your dog picked up the scent of human remains. Why weren't you freaking out? Well, the answer to that is simple. Even the most highly trained cadaver dog gets things wrong sometimes, and in a place like Washington, where we get California's annual rainfall on a Tuesday, damp scents can often confuse HRD, or human remain detection dogs. So, when my dog started to alert, our policy was basically just let him do his thing, because best case scenario was a false positive, and the very worst case scenario, we find some previously unearthed human remains, which, as horrifying as that'd be, was obviously a major part of our job. So the senior team member and I agreed to part ways temporarily. She'd wait on the trail, while my dog and I went off to follow the scent that he'd picked up. Since we both figured it was just a false positive, it would only be a matter of minutes before my dog lost the scent, and then we'd be back on the trail and on our planned route before we knew it. But then, a few minutes turned into like 10 minutes of walking through the dark woods, and then after my dog started to lead me down a fairly steep slope, I lost my footing and took a really nasty fall. The next thing I know, my chest is on fire, probably from the 2 broken ribs that I just sustained, and I could feel blood oozing from where I'd bashed my head on a rock on the way down. The first thing I did was press the emergency alert on my GPS, which signals base camp that one of the team needs assistance. The second thing I did was start calling out for my dog because I'd lost control of his leash during the fall, which I think scared him so bad that he ran off or something. That, or he just mindlessly followed the scent trail thinking that I was still following close behind. As you can probably figure, I was not feeling like my best self. I was in agony, I was confused, and having dropped my flashlight as well as the leash during the fall down the slope, I couldn't see very well either. I just lay there, calling out for Brody, hoping that base camp had someone closing in on my position so I could get to the damned hospital already. I don't know exactly how long I was lying there before someone showed up, but when I heard footsteps getting closer and closer, I felt this wave of relief washing over me. I started to call out something like, "I'm here, I think I broke something," assuming it was a fellow SNR volunteer, but the second I heard their voice, I knew that they weren't with our group. Like I said, we did all kinds of icebreakers and bonding exercises, as every year there tends to be a couple of new volunteers. But the voice I heard that night didn't belong to a long-term team member, and it didn't belong to the new girl or new guy either, as we only had 2 new faces on the team that year. It was a man's voice, and when they started talking instead of directly helping me, I swear, it sent this chill of fright running right through me. The voice most definitely belonged to a man, and they started talking about how I was in a dry creek bed, one that dozens of people fall into every year. He went on to say that at least one person dies there every year thanks to the flash floods the place sees during the rainy season. Someone falls, they get stuck, and then they drown. I went from asking for help to literally begging for it, but the guy just completely ignored my requests and carried on giving his little speech about how often folks go missing or lose their lives out in that area of the woods. I remember losing my temper and asking what the hell was wrong with him. And when he replied with something like, "You're not in a position to talk to me like that," I started to scream. Not wild screams of fright, but help. Somebody help, over and over, while I tried and failed to reach for my flashlight. I also cannot overstate how goddamn painful that was, having to scream when doing so made the burning pain in my chest feel so much worse. And around about that time, I started to hear my dog Brody calling out for me. He's part Australian Shepherd, and he's a very vocal dog, so I started to hear a series of awoos, trills, and rolled barks, all of which tended to mean, "Hurry your butt up, human." As soon as Brody started making those noises, the shadowy figure stopped talking, and then as we both started to hear the sound of Brody getting closer and closer, I heard that guy's footsteps as he made a hasty retreat. I think maybe a minute or two later I start hearing more footsteps, only they're from multiple people that time, and they came with flashlights. I call out for help one more time, and the next thing I know, 2 of my fellow volunteers are walking up the creek bed, and one shines their flashlight right on me. My first thought was to tell them about the guy that had just been talking to me, the one that had talked about the accidental deaths in a way that made me think that they weren't so accidental. I know that might sound kind of crazy, but the way he talked about them, like those deaths made him happy, it was one of the creepiest encounters of my entire life. So yeah, I told my 2 rescuers about the stranger, and one of the first things they did before administering first aid was to make sure that he was actually gone. One guy shone his flashlight all around while the other started asking me, "Were you pushed?" And both later said that they were scared that that creepy guy had been the cause of my injuries. Hence, one asked if I was pushed or not, and then asked if I was sure about that when I said no. But don't get me wrong, I was terrified that he was about to do something, especially since I was basically incapable of getting away from him. But he didn't cause me to slip. He was just there to see it, or maybe hear it. But that obviously raises the question of, what the hell was he doing out there in the first place? My 2 teammates then kept me company until the medics showed up with an ATV and a backboard that they could attach a stretcher to. I was then slowly driven back to base camp, given a quick look over, and then we headed over to a very rural medical clinic once we figured out my ribs were broken. Once I'd been given some pain medication and the doctors told my team leaders I was stable, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and a bunch of my fellow volunteers came to visit me in the morning to see how I was doing. And that's when I finally got a chance to tell everyone about the guy that had showed up in the minutes after my fall, and how his warnings sounded an awful lot like thinly veiled threats. About a week later, after I'd been discharged from the hospital and I was safely back at home, I got a call from that same senior team member that I'd been with before my fall. She asked how I was doing, how my recovery was progressing and stuff like that, and she then told me that the team leaders were discussing a change of locations for the following year's retreat. A couple of other team members had reported someone walking around in the dark, someone who definitely wasn't a volunteer, and that after talking it over, they decided that safety was paramount and that they'd be looking at alternative locations. In the words of one team leader, a second run-in with that creepy, shadowy stranger was not something they were willing to risk.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
Years ago, man, I'm old, but let's say the mid-1990s. I worked as a woodland firefighter while in the Army Reserves. I worked as a spotter, basically being stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds. I would use binoculars and look out for fire smoke and other telltale signs of fire. My nearest compadre was 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on the lookout for anyone who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildlife, and staying afoot of bears and wolves. The way our shifts worked back then was 1 week on, 1 week off, so we slept in the towers and cooked our food, etc. One day on one of my tracks out for food in my Jeep, I came across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends with me, and I safely set off the trap, then picked it up to take to the ranger station. Poaching is illegal in the park and carried a big fine even back then and some jail time. But it didn't stop the poachers from trying. I heard rifle shots and headed back for my fire tower. And we did have a rifle in the tower, but only to be used in case of emergency. A few months back, a fellow spotter had been mauled to death by a grizzly, so each tower had been outfitted with a rifle. I looked with my binoculars, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. So I radioed my coworker Ben, who was an older guy in the adjacent tower, and he hadn't heard anything, but had come across a few traps himself. That night, after dinner of frankenbeans and toast, I was riding to my future wife when I heard the rumbling of a truck, thinking it was maybe Ben. Occasionally he made the trek over and we would crack open a soda and chew the fat for a bit. It wasn't. Instead, I saw 4 men with rifles get out of the truck, one looking around and leaning up against the truck, whilst the other 3 grabbed traps and began to set them. I grabbed a rifle and my lantern and headed down the stairs. I was only 21 at the time, a farmer's son from a rural Virginia farming town. And even with 1 deployment behind me, I was naive. I should have called it into the Rangers, but instead, I thought I could talk some sense into our 4 dangerous men. I barely got a "hey, what are you doing" out of my mouth before I was roughly shoved by bare hands. My lantern fell, and I heard it crack. Then my rifle was kicked away from me. I felt the breath leave my chest when I was violently kicked in the stomach. I barely had caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men and was shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we walked for miles, but in reality, it was probably only a mile. However, I noticed that there was no sounds in the forest, and it is rarely silent. It's usually a cacophony of sounds, even at night. Owls, wolves, and crickets. But on this night, nothing. Suddenly, I was shoved onto my knees, and I felt hot tears well up. Thought of my parents, my little sister, brother, and my fiance who were back home in Virginia. When I heard the rack of a gun, I shut my eyes and prayed. Then suddenly, the night erupted. But it was the sounds of sirens, those of forest rangers, and behind them in his pickup, Ben, who had tried to radio me that he had heard a car's engine and come to my tower when I hadn't replied. The poachers were arrested. Ben drove me back to the tower. I was still shaking. He didn't lay into me for not following the procedure, but just said that it was a close kid. I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home. But I never ran into any more poachers during the rest of my time. I kept in contact with Ben for a while and sent him a wedding invite and a photo of my firstborn son in 1997. However, as time usually does, we lost track of one another. And a few years back, I Googled him to discover he'd passed away a few years back. He would have been 75 or so. I don't know whatever came of those poachers, but I know I never want to meet them again.
I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it, To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs, either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned, dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. but I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now, I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill do die, but once in a while, they find their way to you.